We got one more guest here for this Thursday edition of Bang the Book Radio. That is professional handicapper Tony George from Doc Sports. Tony, how's it going today, man?
Good, man. Good. Ready to get it going here. Big weekend in the NFL, obviously. Championship Sunday, and of course, big slate of college basketball games. Still trying to figure out college basketball this week. Having a rough week in college basketball, and a lot of road teams. Both road teams. The Big 12 won last night, and I was on one of the home teams, and so kind of scratching my head this morning getting that figured out. And the NBA's rolled along real well for me, so a lot of stuff on my plate today, buddy.
Yep, and we'll do the NFL and the NBA here on today's segment. And, Tony, before we talk about these two games specifically here, I got to say, something that does make me happy about this is I think the four best teams are here. These should be two very good games, totals in the mid-50s. This is what it should be, I think, as opposed to last year. Jacksonville had the great defense, but no offense to speak of. I think this is what we all wanted to see.
Well, if I did a video I do these videos on YouTube. We talk about them on here all the time. I do an NFL opening line report, and I just kind of raw and candid take for about 10 minutes on just initial reactions. And one of my comments was this: if this was college football and this was the BCS championship, Final Four, nobody be bitching, because these are the best four teams in the NFL, bar none. You probably have four of the top six coaches in the NFL coaching in these games. You've probably got, a lot of the offensive and defensive coordinators are some of the best, in the NFL. Sean McVay obviously doubling as offensive coordinator, and Andy Reid co-offensive coordinator. You've got great special teams. You've got a lot of home field advantages you could talk about. Everybody deserves to be here, and everybody also needs to know that you have two underdogs that could both win outright on the road this weekend. So it's a real tough call on these games. No one's going to go crazy on these games. If you do, you're crazy. But you got exactly what you wanted. You got four of the best knocking heads this weekend, and it's going to come down to a few penalties, a crucial turnover, maybe a special teams blunder that's probably going to decide them. It's really that close, Adam.
Well, and I mean, that's why we see these lines sitting on that key number of 3, basically implying that these teams are all pick 'em or around there on a neutral field. 3-point home field advantage for both teams here. Maybe you could make a case for 3.5, I think, for New Orleans in the Superdome, but now this line is mostly 3 out there. What do you think about this number coming down off of 3.5, Tony?
Well, there's some future. I think a lot of the play into the Rams games. There's some futures money, and books want some extra money on the Rams. I actually think it's cheap. I will disagree with you. Well, just slightly by a half a point. I will give, without question, and I do give New Orleans a 4-point home field advantage in every game. They're that good in there. You've got the line drop down to 3 at BetOnline, CG Technology, and William and Hill this morning all have New Orleans at 3. They've taken the hook off. You're not going to get any movement on the Kansas City line whatsoever. They're not going to give New England, a hook, in a championship game like this when they're already an underdog. That is not going to move. But at the end of the day, I'm a little at the end of the day, the value, lies with the home teams here. I mean, if you look at New England, Adam, they struggle on the road. They've got losses to Miami, the Lions, the Jags, the Titans on the road. Brady has not been – they haven't protected him well on the road. They're 0-3 in AFC Championship games on the road, their last 3. Kansas City is a full 3 points home field. If you've never been to a game in Arrowhead, and I've been to probably 50 of them over the years. I lived in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then Kansas City the last 12 years before moving out here. I've been there many times. It's more like a college atmosphere than anything that I've ever seen in the NFL. And I've probably been to 20 NFL stadiums to NFL games over the year. And it's a distinct home field advantage. I don't think the refs are going to be so much. I mean, you say New England gets breaks with the refs, and they tend to at home a lot, not so much on the road. So that's a little bit of a disadvantage for them, Yeah, but you got the old, when it comes to the Kansas City and New England game, you've got the most experienced quarterback pretty much in the NFL, maybe the greatest of all time, probably the best zone passer. If Kansas City was to man them because they don't have a downfield threat and man up on defense, and not give Edelman everything underneath, I will tell you that, New England's going to have a really tough time beating Kansas City because Kansas City is going to score points. There's no doubt about it. And while Patrick Mahomes is not Tom Brady, I don't care all the hype, everything you've heard about him all year long. He's a magical player. If he remains healthy, he's going to be one of the better ones around, for years to come. But at the end of the day, he's not that much. He's played better than Brady this year, if you look at some of the numbers. But at the end of the day, you still got Brady and Belichick, and that's going to give people great pause to lay 3 with Kansas City, especially with Andy Reid coaching. But the one point I wanted to make, pardon me, and I'll get your feedback on this, as I'm nursing kind of a head cold here. Andy Reid in the playoffs, we all know what the story is. Belichick beat him in the Super Bowl 24-21 when he was coaching the Eagles. But at the end of the day, Andy Reid has changed his coaching philosophy this year. He is not sitting on it. Bear in mind, Kansas City had a 21-3 halftime lead last year in the playoffs and lost because he sat on a lead and tried to protect it. He wasn't aggressive. He hasn't done that this year. He has the type of team he doesn't need to be aggressive. He has a type of offense. You're not going to put the reins on Mahomes. He's a playmaker. He's got playmakers all over the field. They got the biggest playmaker in the NFL in Tyreek Hill, and I think that's a huge advantage for Kansas City is that Andy Reid has kind of changed his coaching philosophy a little bit. And if they were to get up 14 points for some reason or another, they're not going to sit on it, Adam.
Well, and that was something you isolated early on in the season about Andy Reid and how, he had changed his spots. And that's a good thing for a veteran head coach like that. Maybe it's because he has Pat Mahomes instead of somebody like Alex Smith. And, maybe that does kind of play itself out here a little bit in this game. So I guess my follow-up question to that, Tony, would be, it sounds to me like maybe you like the total a little bit in that AFC Championship game.
Yeah, don't let the weather fool you. It's obviously going to be cold. I mean, my wife's one of those weather bugs, and she's homesick moving from Kansas City, and she basically gives me an hour-to-hour update on a daily basis of what the weather's doing back home. So I know what's going on there. They're going to get a bunch of snow. Then it's going to subside, and then they're going to get an Arctic blast with a lot of cold air. I don't think the wind's going to be at a high rate on Sunday. You never know with the weather until it actually is there, but you want to keep an eye on that. But, at the end of the day, both these teams are going to score. But the one thing that when I've harped about it on your show, Bob Sutton, he's not one of the best defensive coordinators in the league by a long shot. But what they came up with last week, if you look at the Colts, they had no meaningful yards whatsoever when it counted. Everything they got was in garbage time. I think the first down they got was on the last drive of the first half. They went into a prevent defense, and they let them go down the field there with less than a minute left, and then Vinatieri missed a field goal. And then other than that, it was the end of the game when Kansas City already had to put them away. And the other thing of note, when you want to pull the trigger on the total, Adam, the last 5 opponents that have came into Arrowhead Stadium with what you hear all over ESPN and NFL Network and Fox Sports, one of the worst defenses in the NFL, the last 5 opponents that came into Kansas City scored 14 points or less. And that's something to take note of for sure. But do I think it's going to be could it be a 35-31 game? Very well could be. Don't let the weather, unless it's going to be blowing 25 miles an hour, and there's going to be flurries, then maybe the under. You want to take a look at this total closer to game time when you have a real accurate forecast. But Kansas City does one thing, and they do one thing very well. That's put points up on the board. They can go 5 plays, 90 yards, and put 7 up in less than a minute, at any point in time because they've got a quarterback and they've got a wide receiver, they've got a tight end, and now they got Sammy Watkins back. All those players on Kansas City's side of the ball pretty much are better than what New England's bringing to the table right now, especially when they're on the road.
All right, so let's transition to the NBA here, a much different market than the NFL, but we haven't talked a whole lot of NBA here lately, so good time to do that here with you, Tony. I want to talk about how to bet on the NBA using some examples of games that we see on a daily basis and see if we can help our listeners out a little bit here with this. So I want to start with the first game on TNT tonight, game 543-540, Philadelphia 76ers taking on the Indiana Pacers. Premier matchup, billing on cable television. So this game gets a lot of action, gets a lot of interest. What's the starting point for you with a game like that, Tony?
It all comes down to scheduling and strength of schedule in the NBA and, the last 5 game stats. It's right here, right now in the NBA. There's 80-some games every year, just like Major League Baseball is 160. So teams get into cycles, good cycles and bad cycles. It's very cyclical, and they get into ruts or they get into good grooves. And there's really no gray area in between here. But when you take a look at this game here, in my opinion tonight, and I'm not going to have any action on this, I think the wrong team's favored. You've got the Pacers at home, but they're second in the Central. Philadelphia's second in the Atlantic. But you take a look at recently here. First of all, who's playing with revenge? Philadelphia went in here and beat Indiana 100-94 back in early November, and then Indiana returned the favor against Philly in early December, mid-December actually. But remember, Embiid was out for that game. They went in and beat them by 12 points in Philly. So we got a little revenge factor here. But you take a look at Indiana. In Indiana, I will give you this: they do play some defense. They can play when they want to play defense. They're very, very tough to beat. But you take a look at who they've beaten here. They've beaten Phoenix, at home. They beat the Knicks. Then they played a good team in Boston. They lost to them. Then they played Cleveland. They beat them, bad team. Then they had to play, I'm just going back to the schedule in reverse. Then they played Toronto. They lost to them. Then they beat Chicago and Atlanta and Detroit. And then Atlanta again. And then Washington. They've played a bunch of teams that are 500 or below here, and you got a team here that's coming off a 42-point butt whipping, at home against Minnesota here, and they're clicking on all cylinders right now. And I like this spot. One thing, you take a look at Indiana, offensively, they got Oladipo, and that's about it. Now, I like Philadelphia. I like their scoring across the board. Their starter points, now Indiana goes to their bench a lot. They're getting 40 points a game from their bench the last 5 versus Philly at 34. So there's 6 points less on the bench. However, you're getting 14 points more a game out of your starters with Philly than you are with Indiana. And you also got a rebounding edge here with Philly. And I like Philly in this spot just because Indiana has been beaten up on a bunch of weak sisters, and I think Philadelphia is a much better team right now.
All right, so you mentioned that you think the wrong team is favored here, and from what it looks like to me, this is a basically pick-em game on a neutral with Indiana getting about 2.5 points of home court advantage. What is home court advantage worth to you in the NBA?
A couple. There are certain places, I'll give Utah and Denver, because of the elevation, I usually give them 3 points. I give them more than that, especially if they're playing like an East Coast team traveling west. We're going to talk about one of these games, a West Coast team traveling east tonight, in your next segment here. But at the end of the day, a lot of these home floors, you look at a lot of these games, these stadiums are half full. 3/4 full. It's not like you're playing at Cameron Indoor. It's not like you're playing in East Lansing, Michigan, or Lincoln, Nebraska tonight, sold out for the Michigan State game. You don't have that huge home court advantage. There are some teams that pack the Raptors. Boston does, for instance. But there are very few teams that really have a distinct home court advantage. More than a point and a half just for playing at home. But it changes once you start looking at scheduling. So it's deeper than just what you're saying, face value. If Philadelphia was on the fourth game in 8 days on a 4-game road trip, or 6 days, playing their fourth game in 6 days on the road, then home court becomes an advantage. Philly played at home, had a day's rest. Now they're coming in, they're playing this game tonight. So the home court advantage goes down significantly based on the scheduling.
All right, so to recap here, all things being equal with the spot, with neither team in a really terrible spot, you're looking at basically a couple points home court advantage, and you want to look at the recent results over the last 5 or 10 games, see who they've played, who they've beaten, how they've fared. Now let's talk about a game that you just mentioned with a West Coast team coming east, 5:45, 5:46, Sacramento and Charlotte. Yes, Sacramento coming east, start a road trip. Charlotte, first home game back off of a long road trip. So how do you sort of weigh those two spots against each other?
Well, one thing involved here, Saturday, Sacramento played Charlotte. I had a 7-unit game of the month top play on the Kings. Based on what I just told your listeners, they had played Denver, Phoenix, Clippers, Portland, and they lost to the Clippers and the Portland going in to play Sacramento. That was their 5th game in 8 days. And amazingly, they went into San Antonio 2 days after I think it was on Monday, and beat the Spurs. Tony Parker going back home. Obviously, the Charlotte's head coach was a Popovich assistant coach for years, so he was kind of homecoming for him, and they really dialed it in there. Shocked me that they beat, as a 7.5-point underdog at San Antonio. But Sacramento right now is kind of under the radar. People aren't paying a lot of attention to Sacramento. They're 2 games over 500. They're putting up a lot of points. They're 27-17 on over and unders this year. They've got a lot of good players. Do you really want to get in front of them? They've when you take a look at them, they've beaten Portland. They beat Charlotte. They beat Detroit. They've beaten Orlando. They played Golden State within 4 points at home. They've kind of been hit and miss here. At the end of the day, though, it's only the first game of the road trip. I will tell you this much. What concerns you the most when you look at the stats, last 5 games, which we're looking at, Charlotte is scoring 105 a game and allowing 113. That is their average margin of loss their last 5 games is 7.2 points, while the average margin of win for Sacramento, their last 5, is 7.4. But Charlotte is negative 7.2 here. You start looking at the numbers that count, in this game. You although the road scenario exists here, you can't ignore better field goal percentage, better 3-point percentage, more rebounds by a mile. And that's one thing that they do very well is they rebound the ball very well. And you're getting more bench points out of Sacramento than you are Charlotte. I know it's a road trip, but it's only the first game of a road swing for them. And they've had a couple days to get ready for this. The whole world's going to be on Charlotte tonight, without a doubt. They're 14-8 at home. They got everybody back. Lamb's back. Everybody's back. They got Walker. They got some good players there. But until they shore their defense up, I can't lay points with them, Adam.
All right, so then one more game to touch on here, 5:47, 5:48, Phoenix and Toronto. And as I mentioned in my notes to you, Tony, and as I mentioned in my situational betting article in the beginning of the week, this was a flat spot for Toronto. This was a very flat spot coming off of the Boston game last night. As it turns out, Kawhi Leonard's going to sit tonight, and Kyle Lowry's going to sit tonight. So for anybody that played the overnight on Phoenix, kudos to you for getting some line value. But I think that's a good example in and of itself that when a spot looks this bad, maybe it's not a bad idea to play the overnight and hope you get a scenario like this one.
Yeah, you do. They're coming off a loss at Boston. They're probably going to rest some starters, although the rumor was yesterday, just goes to show you the rumor mill and information that NBA teams put out. This is a game you're going to want to wait and see for sure, but Golden State was going to rest their starters last night too off a big win the night before, and they brought them all to the table. So that was the rumor going into that, of course, that was a flat spot for them anyway, coming off a huge win, and they managed to push at 7. But, Phoenix is playing a lot better when Booker's in there. I mean, obviously he makes everything work down there. And, I don't like giving Phoenix double digits anytime simply because they can put up points. There's no doubt about it. Now, they're coming off – plus, Phoenix is coming off just a total butt whipping. They got beat by, 34 points at Indiana here 2 days ago. They've had a lot of time to sit around and think about that. And they haven't fared well on the road. This is only their third road game in 11 games here. Their last 2 road games, they lost at Dallas, which Dallas has a strong home court. They beat Denver after that by 9 points at home, which is impressive, catching 8.5. And then they lose, they win by 17.5 points over the spread margin in that game. Then they turn around and lose by 23.5 against Indiana, who just played some good defense with them. But as I look now, if you'd got the overnights on Phoenix, knowing that they were going to rest their starters, you're definitely going to make out here because there'll be some points put up here. Plus the scheduling spot for Toronto, as we talked about, is so important. And, right now, William and Hill and Westgate right here in Las Vegas have pulled this completely off the board. Offshore, you can still catch 13. I was going to look at my live lines here real quick since I got my computer up and running. And they have currently it's dropped from 13 to 8. So you've lost 5 points of line value if you waited to bet it. You can still catch 8.5 right now at MGM. Westgate just opened it up 3 minutes ago at -8 and 222.5. So, I still think there's value though with Phoenix +8. Remember, this is not 8 points in 8 points in the college in the NBA is like freaking, 8 points in the NFL. That's a ton of points between 2 pro teams here, and Phoenix will bring it. Have no doubt about it. I don't know how excited Toronto's going to be about playing tonight. Obviously, just remember though, second stringers in the NBA are still ballers. Nobody's sitting on the bench in the NBA that is not flat out a frickin' baller. They all can get in there. Are they as good as, Leonard and Lowry? No, but they're not shabby. So it'll be a good ball game there tonight. But the value still lies with Phoenix, but the great value overnight definitely lies with them.
Tony George, professional handicapper over at Doc Sports. What's going on over there right now, Tony?
Well, got a doubleheader tonight in college basketball off an 0-3 night last night. I always tell it like it is, Adam. Got skunked last night in basketball. 3 plays all won, go figure. But at the end of the day, got to bounce back tonight. Big game between Nebraska and Michigan State in the Big Ten. And then a small conference hidden gem where actually one team is favored and shouldn't be, and they're even at home. And somebody's going to come up and bite them in the butt tonight. So we got a doubleheader there. And in NBA, I've been playing a lot of NBA first-half lines this year. As a matter of fact, we talked about on your show last week, Adam, I've only lost one first-half line in the NBA this entire season. And we have a first-half line play tonight in the NBA. And, of course, Championship Sunday cards will be up and here later today, 5 o'clock Central. So, get over to Docs and check it out. Follow me over there on YouTube with my daily free plays and tell you like it is each and every day over there and what's on deck. So, sure and get over there and check out the YouTube page as well.
And you can also follow Tony on Twitter at TGeorgeSports. Tony, appreciate the time as always, man. Thank you so much for those NBA breakdowns. We'll talk to you again next week.
You bet, Adam.